What's up guys, Perry from Rockville here, and today I'm going to show you how to set up your Bass Blaster 10. So along with the sub itself, you also get a power cable to power the sub, so we're going to go ahead and plug that in so we can get started. So before we dive in, let's take a look at the back of the sub where we have the controls, inputs, and outputs so we get a better understanding of how to work the sub. So first off, we have the power button to turn the sub on or off. So let's go ahead and turn it on. Above the power switch, we have the volume knob so we can control the overall volume coming out of the sub. And we have the frequency knob, which acts as a low pass filter for the sub. This just means we get to control the frequency range coming out of the sub. So for example, if I set this knob to about 100 Hertz, we're gonna be hearing everything from 100 Hertz and below and nothing above that 100 Hertz. So this knob just helps us fine tune the low end frequencies coming through in our overall setup. Next to that, we have the line RCA input and RCA output. The RCA input allows us to receive signal from outside sources like receivers, powered speakers, etc. And then the RCA output allows us to expand our setup even further to additional powered speakers, additional subwoofers, and much more. Below that, we have the phase switch to flip the phase of the subwoofer between 0 degrees and 180 degrees. You basically want to use this switch if you feel like the subwoofer isn't in sync with the rest of your setup. So for example, if you're listening to music, you hear a kick drum in the mix, but you don't feel like it's being pushed out, this might be because your subwoofer is out of sync or out of phase. So if you're experiencing that, we would recommend you try using the phase switch here to get the subwoofer in sync with the rest of your setup. Next, we have the auto switch so we can determine how the subwoofer is powered on. So for example, if we had this in the off position and I tried to power on the sub, it doesn't power on at all. Now if I go to the auto mode, the sub won't power on unless it's receiving signal from your receiver or any other source. And when I have this switched all the way to on, that means the subwoofer will power on as soon as we turn the power switch on. Next, we have the high-level input terminals and the high-level output terminals. You can use these terminals to expand your setup even further, like in a home theater setup while using passive speakers. And lastly, we have the LED switch, which will engage the sound-activated LEDs inside of the sub. So if I switch this to off, that means the LEDs won't come on at all. And if I switch this to the on position, that means the LEDs will only come on as soon as there's music playing through the sub. Now, one of the ways we can use our Bass Blaster 10 is with our home theater setup with a receiver like our Bluetooth LED here. Now, the cool thing about the Bluetooth is that there's a designated RCA output for the subwoofer labeled sub out. But in case your receiver doesn't have RCA outputs, we do have another way of setting it up to the receiver and to your speakers. For that, you're gonna need 2 sets of speaker wire to connect the subwoofer to your receiver, and then you're gonna need 2 more sets of speaker wire to connect your speakers. So I'm gonna start with 2 sets of speaker wire here, and I'm gonna plug the ends of both sets into the left and right high-level input here on the back of my sub. So to start, I'm gonna unscrew the high-level input terminals here on the back of my sub. I'm then gonna take 2 sets of speaker wire and plug one end into the left and right input terminals here on the back of the sub. I want to make sure to match the positive wires with the positive terminals and the negative wires with the negative terminals. Then I'm going to plug the other ends into the positive and negative output terminals on the back of my receiver. So now I've got my subwoofer connected to my receiver, and now the next thing I want to do is connect my main speakers to the subwoofer. So to do that, I'm going to take 2 more sets of speaker wire and plug one end into the high-level output terminals on the back of my sub. Then plug the other ends into the terminals of my speakers, and just keep track of which wire you have set to the left channel and which wire you have set to the right channel. So take the wire that's coming from the right output terminal and plug that into your right speaker, then plug the wire that's coming from the left output terminal into your left speaker. And just like that, you have all of your speakers connected to your receiver. Again, you just want to use this setup if your receiver doesn't have RCA outputs, but because we have a designated sub out here on the Bluetooth, we have a much simpler way of connecting our Bass Blaster 10 to the receiver. So you just need an RCA cable, and you're gonna plug one end into the sub out on the back of the Bluetooth, then plug the other end into the RCA line input on the back of the sub. From here, you can set up the volume for your sub, you can set the frequency knob to your desired frequency range, adjust the phase switch if you need that for your setup, and then also determine how you want the auto mode set up. For today, we're just gonna leave it all the way to the on position so that it's always receiving power. So now I'm gonna place the sub on the floor so we can hear how it sounds with the rest of our home theater setup. Oh yeah, blasting bass. That's great. Ooh, really feel that low end. Now another way we can use the Bass Blaster 10 is by adding it to our studio setup through the audio interface that we're using, which today is our very own R-Track 2x2. So on this interface, we have two separate outputs. So we have the XLR output that we can use for our main speakers, and then we have 1/4-inch outputs, which are free. So that's what we're gonna be using for our subwoofer for today. So because this sub doesn't have 1/4-inch inputs, I'm gonna wanna use an RCA to dual 1/4-inch cable. So I'm gonna plug the 1/4-inch ends into the left and right outputs here on the back of my interface. And then I'm gonna plug the other ends into the RCA inputs on the back of my sub. And once I have my speakers set up to the interface and my interface plugged into my computer, I can then go into the sound settings of my computer and switch the input and output device to my interface. So to do that, we're gonna start with the input section here, and then we're gonna look for the device that reads R-Track 2x2, and then we're gonna click on it to set it as the input device, and then we're gonna do the same thing for the output device. So we're gonna click on output here, scroll down till we see R-Track 2x2, click on it. And if you're planning on using your DAW with this whole setup, we recommend checking the input and output device on your DAW as well and set it to the interface that you're using. So now from here, we can set up the volume for our sub and then the frequency knob to control the frequency range coming through. And now we're all set to use the subwoofer with our studio setup. So now let's go ahead and hear how it sounds. Right off the bat, you're hearing that bass. Now the last way I want to show you how to set up your Bass Blaster 10 is by setting it up with your live sound setup with a mixer like our very own Rock Mix 8 and two of our powered speakers, which are the BPA 10s. Now this mixer has a couple of different outputs that we can use for this setup, including the control room left and right outputs. This would be a great option because we have an independent volume knob, so we can blend in the sound of this sub with the overall setup. And there's also the RCA output that we can use from the mixer to plug into the RCA input for the sub. So first, let me show you how to use it with the 1/4-inch outputs here on the mixer. So for that, I'm going to need an RCA to dual 1/4-inch cable. I'm gonna plug the 1/4-inch ends into the left and right control room output here on the mixer. Then I'm gonna plug the other ends into the RCA line input on the back of my sub. From here, I can raise the volume on my sub and set the low pass filter to the desired frequency range. And lastly, on the mixer, you're gonna raise the control room volume knob. And again, you can blend the subwoofer to taste. So if you ever want the sub to be lower, you can just lower the control room knob. And if you want it louder, you can raise the volume knob a bit higher. Like I mentioned, the other way we can do this is by using the RCA outputs here on our mixer. So for that, I can take an RCA cable and plug one end into the 2-track RCA output here on the Rock Mix 8, then plug the other end into the RCA inputs on the back of the sub. After that, I can raise the volume and set the frequency knob, and now I'm all set to use my subwoofer with my live sound setup. So now I'm gonna set it back onto the floor, play a new song, and hear how it sounds. Oh, that's awesome. Sounds so good with the speakers. So hopefully this showed you guys how easy it is to set up your Bass Blaster 10. But of course, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to reach out to our customer support team through phone or email. As always, I'm Perry from Rockville, and we'll see you guys next time.